then right, if the universe began to exist and then it needs a cause. And sure, right, there's an argument for God there. Aquinas wouldn't deny that if something begins to exist, it requires a cause. He would just say things require a cause even if they don't begin to exist, right? Because they have a certain nature, like a composite nature. So even if, you have a toaster strudel. I don't know if you have toaster strudels out by you guys, right? A little breakfast pastry. It's very American. That's why we have weight problems. But even if one of those things was just like past eternal, right? For whatever reason, like it never began to exist in time. It's just an everlasting toaster strudel. Aquinas would say this is the sort of thing whose its nature is still modally contingent, right? So we still need a reason for why this thing exists at all, even if it's always sort of been there.
What is the best argument for God? And can we prove God? What is the nature of God? These are all very important questions, and today we will discuss them with the new superstar of philosophy of religion, Pat Flynn, and he's a philosopher, fitness trainer, author, father of many children, and also the author of this new book, The Best Argument for God. And I suppose this is a very great title and very great book. So thank you so much, Pat, for your time. How are you doing?
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I really enjoyed your new book. It's really great. I hope that in my past future I would have this book. It is really great. So let's start with some basic questions. How did you become a Christian, and why did you decide to study philosophy of religion?
Yeah, well, boy, that's a big question. I'll try to give the short story or the executive summary. So for many years, I wasn't Christian. I wasn't religious. I didn't even believe in God. I was in the naturalist camp, right? And my leanings towards a naturalist worldview started fairly young. They weren't philosophically refined by any means, but once I got to high school, I was really starting to get interested in philosophy proper. And I was particularly interested in some of the old atheists and existentialists. So I sort of followed that route for many years. But at the same time, I was always haunted by just the big questions of philosophy, questions of existence, contingency, consciousness, morality. And it wasn't like I encountered a bunch of arguments for God that convinced me. Really, what happened for me was just trying to get things to fit within a naturalistic worldview, trying to actually get the sorts of explanations that I think were required and just not finding them. I felt that to be a consistent naturalist really required being something like an eliminativist across a wide range of data. You hear lots of, this isn't all naturalists, but lots of naturalists will, sort of make what seem to be very odd claims about the nature of reality, that a lot of what seems to be the case actually isn't the case, whether it's the moral dimension, moral truths, or human consciousness, subjectivity. And I found those answers to be deeply unsatisfying, to say the least. So over time, I sort of just let that worldview go. And I felt like I was kind of in midair for a while. I didn't really have a particular worldview or commitment, but I decided to reconsider things. And I wanted to go back to some of the older thinkers that I had a passing familiarity with, in my undergrad philosophy courses and stuff like that, Aristotle and Plato, and give them another go, give them another shake. And the more time I spent with, let's call it perennial philosophy or big tent Platonism, the more I began to think that these guys, okay, they're wrong about some things for sure, but I think like their general big picture is actually pretty accurate, right? They have a pretty good system going here. And so I became like increasingly convinced by the way that they saw the world as, anti-reductionist, anti-materialist, anti-skeptical, anti-relativist, anti pretty much all the things that modern philosophy is. And thinking like, there's a really good system here. And then the guy that really, I think, kind of tied it all together for me was Thomas Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas. And not even just him, but sort of his followers, the Thomistic tradition. And the way I see Aquinas is he's not so much like the first great medieval philosopher as he is like the last great classical philosopher. He's the guy that kind of like synthesized these the Aristotelian and Neoplatonic strains of thought and like almost kind of perfected the system, or at least he got most of it right. There's a saying of Aristotle I heard recently that Aristotle got 70% of philosophy 70% right, which I guess is like 50%. Pretty good, right? I think Aquinas maybe is like 90% of philosophy, 90% right. and his followers kind of like worked out, some of the, around the edges, I guess. And so that's right. And so that convinced me of a lot of things, in terms of like worldview construction, right? Like, I'm not a nominalist. I'm an essentialist. I believe things have essences, how he thinks of normativity. And of course, the big one is the existence of God, right? So for Aquinas, a God is sort of the necessary condition for his entire metaphysical system. And we can talk about some of those arguments later if we want. But how did I become a Christian? Well, you can't spend a whole lot of time with either Thomas himself or a lot of his followers without getting a lot of theology along with philosophy. So, I mean, Aquinas himself was mostly a theologian, right? Philosophy was the handmaid to his theology. And so, at first I sort of ignored a lot of it. As I was becoming a theist, I was kind of looking more towards Eastern traditions, Buddhism and Hinduism, in terms of just, religious curiosity, religious pluralism, stuff like that. But over time, as I began to really, I guess, entertain more of the theological claims, I found them to be increasingly not the sorts of crazy ideas that I guess my culture told me they were growing up, to have a lot of caricatures exploded. And I began to see an actual system that itself was internally quite coherent. And then, I wanted to look into the history a bit. And then, that side, I think there's actually a very strong historical case that could be given for the core claims of Christianity. And so that's how that all, sort of came together, if you will. And then, of course, that's the intellectual side. There's moral conversion and all that stuff too, We could talk about that if we want, but yeah, that was a big part of it. I think Christianity had the best answers to the biggest questions that a human person can ask, the most satisfying ones, the intellectual, the moral, the salvific, all of it. So here we are. How's that?
Yeah. Well, great. Absolutely. I like your story really, because this idea of accepting complex system, not just one strain of soul, but complex system like in Thomas. And I always like this idea of having complex philosophical worldview, not just one question, but when you have all of this together. So that's great.
Yeah. Well, let me talk to that, because sometimes, I'm a fan of a number of Aquinas's arguments for the existence of God, his de ante argument or something like that. And sometimes, people will criticize that argument because they'll say, well, that depends on a whole metaphysical system. And I'll be like, well, duh. But I think it's a great metaphysical system, right? Like, I think that the system does an enormous amount of fruitful work across a range of very big issues, like perennial issues, like the problem of the one and the many, or how we think about normativity through real essentialism. So like, I'm a big fan of the system. That's not a bug to me. That's a feature. Give me the system. And if the system entails the existence of God and classical theism, all the better, man. Bring it on. So I'm with you. Yeah, we agree. That's not a problem. I don't think so. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose, as your book shows, so on the most basic level, it is like ultimately question about what is the most plausible premise that we accept. For example, is there any brute fact or no, or is there any something necessary in our world? And if we accept this one premise, from this premise we can show all others ideas and consequences, something like this. And so I suppose, let's start with this. Do you think that we can prove God, like Edward Fesser uses word of 5 proof of God, yeah? And Thomas, I suppose, used also. Do you think that we can actually prove God, or is like more best explanation of things?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I want to say yes, but we have to be careful about how when somebody like Edward Fesser, who is in that Thomistic scholastic tradition, uses proof, he means it by way of what's called a metaphysical demonstration. And a metaphysical demonstration is something like this. We start with some fact of experience that is so common and so obvious that we don't think you can coherently deny it. So, for example, the fact that change occurs, or the fact that some things are contingent or some things are composite, right? And then what a metaphysical demonstration aims to do is to uncover the necessary conditions or condition for that fact of experience. And it typically goes through a sort of deductive chain of reasoning, right? So the idea is, if we follow, the implications, the metaphysical implications of some undeniable fact of experience, we are necessarily led to something that we can appropriately call God because it fits a certain definite description as purely actual or incomposite, and there's a whole lot of like deep thought that goes into that. But the idea there is, if that method is viable, it gives you a sort of metaphysical certainty in the existence of God as a necessary condition for, very broad scale features of the world. It doesn't give you a sort of probabilistic confidence or credence in the existence of God that other approaches do. So if you ask me, do I think you can prove God in that sense? Yeah, I think you can. But that doesn't mean it's easy, right? You gotta do a lot of metaphysical work, right? And even Fazer does a fair bit in his book to sort of defend, I think, the kind of minimal metaphysical commitments he needs to run those sorts of arguments, right? So if that's what we mean by proof, yeah, I think there's a few good proofs for the existence of God that we can give. But again, that doesn't mean they're easy to run. It doesn't mean they're even easy to understand. I just think at the end of the day, they are sound arguments, and they are, of course, system dependent, right? And then, so there's that, right? The other approach that you're talking about seems to be more of what goes on in philosophy of religion with respect to worldview comparison. And this is typically an approach that looks to use something like inference to the best explanation. And this is where people come to the philosophical table with different competing worldviews. Somebody might say, I'm a theist. Here's what I mean by God. Here's kind of what my worldview hypothesis is. Somebody is, across the table, they're a naturalist, and they'll say, okay, here's what the sort of my hypothesis is. Here's what I think is at the root of reality. Now what we're going to do is we're going to kind of test our respective theories or hypotheses and see which one better explains or anticipates the data, and which really exhibits more overall theoretical virtues like explanatory comprehensiveness or simplicity or stuff like that, right? Now, I think that is can also be an effective approach. I think it also has its limitations. But one of the things there is that, yeah, I don't think that anybody who's engaged in that approach claims that you have a sort of proof or even metaphysical certainty of the existence of God. They might claim that you have just an exceedingly high credence, or you should have an exceedingly high level of confidence in a particular hypothesis, but it's more scientific, right? Where that's really what we're doing, is we're building a confidence, right? But not certainty. So that, what we just described there, I think, distinguishes two approaches to the God question. One is much more traditional, where, philosophers are doing philosophy of nature and metaphysics, and they just see that certain explanatory commitments really entail the existence of God. Whereas in more contemporary times, I guess it's a sort of more scientific approach. And I use that description carefully. Philosophers are not scientists, but it's a sort of hypothesis testing, just at the level of worldview. I think those approaches can play friendly and well together. And that's essentially what I do in my book. At the beginning, I kind of develop a contemporary metaphysical argument for God. And I say, I think this is a pretty good argument. Maybe you're happy with it. If so, you can, close the book and go eat breakfast. Or if nothing else, maybe you want a little more to be said. If so, okay, great. Well, at least that sort of metaphysics first approach has now given us a certain conception of God, right? It's given us a kind of a hypothesis to work with. Now we can go and see how it fares, how it compares against a certain form of naturalism for explaining other features of the world. And I look at those other features, whether it's order, stability, consciousness, rationality, and even suffering and evil. So I actually try to merge the two different approaches to God in my book. So yeah, I'm sorry, I don't even know if that answers your question, because I forget what it is at this point, but there we go.
Yeah, I understand. And in your book, like first part, it's like more like Thomas Aquinas, and second part is more like Richard Swinburne. Sounds like this, yeah.
That's a clever way of putting it. Yeah, I guess that is kind of what it's like. Yeah.
Yeah, great. And so let's talk about your first part. It's like main argument, I suppose. And on my estimation, it's like argument from contingency plus first way of Aquinas and plus maybe third way of Aquinas, sounds like this. Yeah. So could you describe your main approach in this part?
Yeah. So it's a cosmological argument, and I call it synthetic because I'm kind of taking different lines of thought from Aquinas's. He doesn't have just 5 ways. He's got considerably more arguments for God than just the 5 ways in the Summa. In fact, the argument of Aquinas that I'm most interested in is his argument from De Ente et Essentia. One might call that the argument from existence. So I'm kind of borrowing heavily from that. I'm also borrowing Leibnizian lines of thought. So these are again different approaches, but let me just give a general idea or sketch of what I'm up to here. So if you follow not necessarily Aquinas, but Leibniz, the way these arguments generally work is they begin by defending a broad causal or explanatory principle, right? And for a lot of thinkers in this tradition, they're defending something like the principle of sufficient reason or the principle of intelligibility, right? You can think of this as sort of the engine that runs a lot of these arguments. And the principle of sufficient reason comes in different forms. I defend a restricted version of it. And it might say something like, hey, and anything that is contingent has an outside explanation or an outside cause or something like that. Or if you're following Aquinas, he has a version of what I would consider the principle of sufficient reason. He says that whatever a thing has, it has it either in virtue of an extrinsic principle or in virtue of the principles intrinsic to itself, the principles of its own nature, right? Now, what both of these formulations sort of have in common is they're discounting, and you said this at the beginning of the episode, they're discounting the possibility of something being a brute fact. And a brute fact is where something seems to require a further explanation, either for why it exists or why it has the characteristics that it does. But there's no answer to be found, right? It is a coherent question that lacks an adequate answer. That's what a brute fact is. You know, Bertrand Russell kind of has a famous line that he once called the universe a brute fact. You know, the universe is just there and that's all, right? Stop asking questions about it, right? Well, seems like I can ask questions about it, right? But if you're going to say that there's no answer to those questions, if you're going to say those questions are coherent, right? It's actually intelligible to ask those sorts of questions, then that's a brute fact. So really what a lot of cosmological reasoning is doing, and what I'm up to in the first section of my book, is defending the principle of sufficient reason and arguing against the brute fact position. I'm arguing that there are not and cannot be any brute facts, right? And that's a pretty bold claim. That's a pretty bold claim, but I think it maps with our basic intuition of the intelligibility of the universe, right? I think like most of us think that there just are answers to questions, right? And that I think actually I want to go further. I want to say that I think most of us believe that there is an adequate answer to every coherent question that can possibly be asked. And if you think that that's right, then I think that you are committed to this general principle of sufficient reason or principle of intelligibility, right? Okay, so what's the connection to God? Well, what I argue is that if that's right, if this principle of sufficient reason is true, and I defend it in the book, by the way, I say a lot of things in favor of this principle. I don't just assume it. Then the only way to satisfy it, the only way to bring brute facts down to zero, is we need a very special sort of theoretical entity, right? We need a theoretical entity that could explain all the sorts of things in reality that are restrictedly intelligible. They can't answer every, coherent question about themselves from the principles of their own nature, right? So what are some of these things? Contingent things don't explain themselves. I would argue that qualitatively finite or limited things don't explain themselves. I would argue that composite things don't explain themselves, right? These are things that are inherently, they're not good candidates for a reality that could be self-explanatory, right? And so what a lot of cosmological arguments do, what Bind does, what Aquinas do, is they engage in an apophatic process where we strip away certain contingency implying features of what fundamental reality must be, right? So if we say, okay, that these sorts of things are not good candidates for an ultimate reality that could explain everything else while also being able to explain itself, then fundamental reality can't be like these things. It can't be contingent. It has to be necessary. It can't be composite. It must be simple. It can't be changing. That's another one that Aristotle focuses on, right? It must be immutable. It must be eternal. All these sort of features or lack of features, better, right? This is the apophatic way in traditional natural theology. Is ultimately, in a lot of respects, telling us what God is not. But the fundamental point that I'm trying to impress here is that if the world is free of brute facts, there's only a very special sort of entity that can actually make that the case. And that very special sort of entity, I claim, is the God of classical theism. This is the only viable candidate that could explain everything that needs to be explained, including itself. And what that means is that if we could grasp the essence of God, and Aquinas says this explicitly, says, if we could grasp the essence of God, which you can't, there would be no mystery as to why God exists and has the nature that he does. Now, we can't grasp the essence of God, but through cosmological reasoning, we have good reason to think that an entity like that actually exists, because if it didn't, then there would be no contingent things or composite things or changing things or anything like that. So that's the general approach. I think that the way I described it is shared among, I think, the best and most brilliant thinkers in this tradition. I have, specific ways of developing it that I think are a little bit unique or novel. But when I think of cosmological reasoning, that's generally what's going on, right? Is that we're looking for a principle of ultimate intelligibility. We're striking away things that could not possibly serve as that fundamental first principle, right? Which would be anything within the natural universe, right? And then we're trying to, as best as we can, specify the attributes or characteristics of what that fundamental first principle could possibly be. And by working that out, I think you get something that is very much appropriately called God, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. Just to clarify for our audience, so basically we try to ask question why until the very end, until we find ultimate answer to every question why. And what is the main difference between this argument, like argument from Aquinas, and contingency from Kalam argument, that we are not arguing from beginning of the universe or something like this. We just argue what is the foundation of all reality, even if universe will, it's again needs some explanation why it exists. Is it
yes. Right? Yeah. So let me get a little bit more specific now, right? So, I mean, there's differences between Aquinas and Leibniz too, but they're not necessarily interested in what flicked the first domino, whether there was a temporal beginning to the universe. They're interested in why does anything exist here and now, right? In a sort of vertical rather than horizontal sense. But even between Aquinas and Leibniz, there's important differences. People who are in the Leibnizian tradition might defend a principle of sufficient reason that say that, all contingent things, even collectively, have a cause. And that's going to avoid circularity, you're going to need to posit the existence of something that is necessary. And then you have to kind of work out, well, what sort of thing could be necessary through itself, right? And I think there's paths there to show you that it's no natural or physical thing. It has to be sort of divine. Aquinas is, in a sense, more metaphysical. So he's got a whole ontology, a constituent ontology for everyday familiar objects, where, just to get to the short of it, he thinks that beings like us, right, are metaphysically composite entities with different constitutive elements or principles. Fundamentally, an essence element, which captures our real definition, that's, the whatness element, and our existence element, which is that in virtue of which we have any actuality or presence in the world, right? And Aquinas thinks that there's actually a real distinction between our whatness and our isness, our essence and our existence, right? And he's got arguments for that. He defends that thesis in several different ways in several different places. But if that's right, then there's nothing about our essence that sort of guarantees our existence. So then we're on a causal hunt, right? How is it that the things that don't have to be in reality, they're contingent, right? Have any actuality, have any presence in the world at all? And this sets him up on his famous causal regress, which is a hierarchical one. It's in the here and now, right? Not looking in the past, but here and now. How is it that I have any actuality or presence in the world? And he thinks that this forces you to ultimately trace back to something that has existence in virtue of what it is, which he thinks actually forces you to say it's something whose essence just is its existence, pure actuality. And then he'll give you arguments of why we should think that is God. So even though those approaches between Leibniz or the Leibnizian tradition and Thomistic one are different, they are concerned with why does anything exist here and now versus these other arguments like the Kalam argument is really looking sort of back in time, if you will, of saying, okay, does physical reality have an actual sort of temporal beginning, right? Like that the universe actually began to exist. Not that it is just being created in the here and now, but it actually began to exist, I don't know, maybe some 13.8 billion years ago or something like that. And then if that's the case, you're going to have another causal principle, which might be something like this, that anything that begins to exist has a cause. And then, which certainly that seems like a very plausible principle to me. Then right, if the universe began to exist and then it needs a cause. And sure, right, there's an argument for God there. Aquinas wouldn't deny that if something begins to exist, it requires a cause. He would just say things require a cause even if they don't begin to exist, right? Because they have a certain nature, like a composite nature. So even if you have a toaster strudel. I don't know if you have toaster strudels out by you guys, right? A little breakfast pastry. It's very American. That's why we have weight problems. But even if one of those things was just like past eternal, right? For whatever reason, like it never began to exist in time. It's just an everlasting toaster strudel. Aquinas would say this is the sort of thing whose its nature is still modally contingent, right? So we still need a reason for why this thing exists at all, even if it's always sort of been there. So a different sort of argument, I think ultimately a more powerful argument at the end of the day. And that's not to disparage the Kalam argument. That's just not an area that I've focused on a whole lot, but it sort of makes irrelevant the question of whether the universe actually had a beginning some however many billion years ago. That Aquinas isn't particularly, it's not to say he isn't interested in that. He just thought that you couldn't philosophically demonstrate that. So, but that didn't bother him because he thought you still had these other demonstrations for the existence of God.
Okay, that's great. And let's maybe how do you approach to this question? Okay, if we don't, from this argument from Aquinas and from contingency, if we don't have answer to did universe have beginning or did universe eternal, something like this. So is it possible that, for example, God exists and necessarily exists this universe as a consequence of God? So how do you approach to these questions? How do we know from these arguments that God actually free in his creation and the universe was created? So it's like from scientific data, from revelation, or we can deduce this from argument itself?
Yeah, that's good. So I think what you're getting at is this issue of what's sometimes called modal collapse, right? And the issue of modal collapse is it's collapsing the distinction between contingency and necessity. So we think that the universe is contingent. It is, but it need not have been. It could have been otherwise. And there is a concern. It's a traditional concern that perhaps there's something about God such that he had to create the universe. Is this what you're getting at, right?
Yeah, or even if some skeptic, for example, say why it's not like just not God, but some entity that produce universe, not just like free personal God, but just entity, something like this.
Yeah. All right. So there's a mix of issues here. So let's just take them. Let's take them one by one. So maybe there's some natural entity that produced the universe. So can the naturalist? All right. Here's the issue that I think we're trying to get. if we want to explain contingency, it seems like we need necessity, right? But the issue is, how do we get contingency from necessity as opposed to just getting necessity from necessity? Why doesn't necessity produce more necessity rather than contingency? Does that sound sort of like what the issue that you're fishing at is? All right, great. Okay, so I think the naturalists can say something there, right? They could say, well, maybe there's some sort of necessary initial state of the universe, and then through some like appeal to quantum mechanics or something, or some appeal to indeterminacy, you get a contingent realm or something like that. Okay, so that's a plausible way, I think, of trying to get contingency from necessity. I think it's a mess for a lot of other theoretical reasons. But I would argue that there nothing physical or nothing natural could be that true necessary being as something that's necessary through itself. And that's where Aquinas' metaphysical arguments come in. Because if his arguments are right, then only a being whose essence is its existence, that is purely actual, that is incomposite, could be a truly necessary being, right? As in ontologically independent. I'm going to say when you examine the details of any natural entity, it violates those conditions, right? If it doesn't violate those conditions, I would say you're just calling God a natural entity, right? It's just merely a verbal disagreement. So I think that's how you deal with that. So while I think the naturalists could give some story about how you get contingency from necessity, I don't think they can actually give a good account of true ontological dependence like the theists can, right? So I don't think that's ultimately going to work. Now, how does the theist get contingency from necessity? Well, I mean, I guess the easy answer is it seems like some sort of model of libertarian agency or free choice is pretty good, right? If God is a being with something like intellect and will, and if we think that there's something analogous to free will and God as we understand it, then this seems like a good way that we could avoid having necessity from necessity, right? And you might just think that's sufficient, right? Because you might think, okay, the universe is contingent. That seems as obvious as anything, but we need a necessary foundation, and it seems like a being that is possessed in some sense of libertarian agency gives us the result we're looking for. So that's reason to endorse that position, right? That itself is reason to endorse that position, right? So people might find that to be an adequate response. In many ways, I find that to be adequate myself. But I think, like, metaphysically, there's some more interesting issues at play. Some people think that if the God of classical theism is as classical theists describe him, a being that is purely actual and incomposite, then God had to create. Why? He had to create because if the act of creation was contingent, it would require something changing in God, right? That's the idea. And you just told me that God is immutable and unchanging. And the way I think you deal with that is through several moves. I think the first thing you show is that it's not in the nature of a cause to change in bringing about an effect. Something is a cause just insofar as an effect is brought about. It doesn't require that the cause itself change intrinsically, right? So I think that there's just an issue there about the nature of causation. I don't think that something intrinsically has to change to be a cause. It just has to be able to produce an effect. And I think for the classical theist, what we should say is that when God creates the world, the contingent order, all the change is extrinsic to God. And it isn't even really change because creation isn't a change, right? That if God creates this world, he is intrinsically the same as if he didn't create this world or created some other world. All the contingency we say is extrinsic to God, because the only difference on the ontological scene is just a world coming about with a causal dependence relation on God. And that model, I think, avoids the issue of this is sometimes called an extrinsic model of divine agency. It's defended in the literature. I defend it myself. And I think that's a kind of deeper and more subtle way to show that there's not a contradiction or even a worrisome tension between a sort of purely actual, immutable, necessary God and a contingent creation. Some deep stuff there, but that's at least a general direction I would go for people who are worried about those concerns. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you. And just to clarification, isn't this first way of Aquinas, it's more like Leibnizian style? because he moves from change, to first mover. Isn't this like more Leibnizian style? But when we speak about, for example, others' way, it's more like essence and existence.
Yeah. So first up, there's a lot of interpretive debate around Aquinas's 5 ways, right? And part of the problem is the 5 ways are very short. They were really meant just to be kind of summaries for beginner theology students. They weren't meant to be like hugely, detailed and defended arguments. I think Aquinas would probably be appalled that people would take them that way. He's got much more detailed arguments elsewhere, like in his De Ente et Essentia. So there's interpretive issues of how should we think of Aquinas's first way. I'm not so sure people would say it's Leibnizian. They would the interpretive issues for his first way, which is the argument from change, or more along, is this an Aristotelian argument in the philosophy of nature, or is it like Aquinas's really novel metaphysic argument considering the order of being? And those are in-house debates. I think they are interesting and they have certain implications, but I think most people generally would want to say that the first way is definitely at least inspired from Aristotle, from Aristotle's argument for motion, right? Second way from becoming. Third way is kind of contingency and necessity, but that's really quite different, I think, when you get into the weeds of how Leibniz is thinking about it. Fourth way is from grades of being, and fifth way is from finality or teleology. Those are his 5 ways. He's depending on what kind of Thomist you are, you're going to think that he's either like a really thoroughgoing Aristotelian, or you might think that he's more Neoplatonist, or like me, you kind of think that he's somebody who's kind of blending the best of both worlds. Yeah, so a lot of in-house debate stuff there. I don't know how interesting it would be to your audience that they can look into it.
Yeah. And regarding your second part of the book, when you like try to analyze worldview with different criterias, so I heard that, for example, like David Bentley Hart said that these arguments, like from fine-tuning, from designs, and so this argument, it's not like applicable to classical theists because they doesn't have any sense for classical theists, because classical theists, they like go from up down, not from down to up, something like this. So what do you think? Do you have any tension between these two approaches?
Yeah, so right. So a lot of classical theists are extremely apophatic, right? What they want to say about God is mostly by the way of negation, what God is not. And they think that that's sufficient to show that God is not a being among beings, that God is radically transcendent. But it also seems to leave us like one very small click away from agnosticism, right? And this relates to your question because a lot of them want to think that, God is so transcendent and so mysterious. Yes, he's purely actual and he's pure goodness and he's incomposite and he's eternal. And Dave, and maybe David Bentley Hart is in this camp, although I don't really think so, and I'll explain why. But what they're going to say is because God is so mysterious to us, we don't know what we could expect from God, right? And since we don't know what we could expect from God, to say that God better predicts or anticipates a finely tuned universe is just to misunderstand the classical theistic paradigm, right? The way they'll say you're being anthropomorphic, right? You're just importing too many human assumptions upon God, right? Now, if David, I forget what David Bentley Hart says about fine tuning, but if he takes that approach, and tries to, dismiss fine tuning as confirmatory evidence for the existence of God, because God is so transcendent, mysterious, and it's just anthropomorphic to make certain expectations of the world that God would create, then I think he's going to be in deep tension with his universalism. Because to my mind, I think that David Bentley Hart thinks we can have exceedingly strong expectations of God, right? If he's a universalist, clearly, right? So I'll leave that for people to investigate on their own, because I don't want to commit myself to, I just don't remember what David Bentley Hart says about fine tuning. But I will say there are theists that are that sort of apophatic or agnostic about God. I guess I'm not. I think that there's traditional metaphysical principles, particularly about goodness, is self-diffusive, right? You find this in the tradition. I defend these principles in the book, that goodness is sort of naturally self-diffusive. It seeks to communicate itself. This is why many traditional theists are committed to the idea of the great chain of being, that if God is going to create, he's going to create very plentifully, right? That there'll be this great chain of being, this great hierarchy of being. This was very much taken up in classical Christian thought, but it's not just a Christian thought, right? So I think you can get positive expectations, at least broad degrees of confidence about the sort of world God would create if he were to create. And that world, as I argue in my book, would very much want to include beings like us, because we're so good and we're so valuable. And if it's just the case that beings like us depend upon a certain physical arrangement, a certain order, a certain stability, a certain fine-tuning, then I want to argue that, yeah, like obviously, right, classical theism anticipates this data. We find this data. It's not so surprising if God exists, but it seems hugely surprising if naturalism is the case, right? That we would have a universe that exhibits these remarkable features of fine-tuning. So, I mean, I think this argument is so obvious, it's hardly worth stating that this is clearly evidence. There's some tricky objections here and there, but I honestly find this one to just be like easy. Like, I think atheists should just concede it, right? I think they should just say, yeah, that's evidence for God, but here's some evidence against God, and like pivot to the problem of evil or something, right? I think that's just the most, plausible way of going about it. So yeah, I don't think this is a problem for classical theists. I think if you're a classical theist who isn't like severely apophatic, which Aquinas is not, right? You know, his negative way is one of his ways to God, but he's also got his way of eminence and his way of causality. He's not that apophatic. I think you can have these expectations that you can bring classical theism into the worldview debate and have fine-tuning confirm it, for sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the beauty of your book that when we have this first part with this argument from contingency, we also have like answers to many objections against fine-tuning and against morality. Like, for example, there exists some multiverse, multi-universe, or there exists some moral platonic objects, and we still could ask questions like, why exists multiverse? Why exists these platonic objects? And we still go again to this first part of your book. So they exist because of something necessary exists, something like this.
Yeah. So the multiverses, I still think probably like the best way that a naturalist could try to deal with fine tuning. But your point is that, okay, even if that is presented as a block to the fine tuning path, it's not a block to the considerations from contingency. And that's definitely right. Now, I think that the multiverse objection is itself hugely problematic for several reasons. But one is that it seems like by any account of the multiverse that is of interest or of use, it itself it doesn't solve the fine tuning issue. It just relocates it, right? I think that's one of the fundamental issues of the multiverse proposal, right? Is that it doesn't actually solve the problem. It just pushes it around. Yeah, I still think that's a big issue. And then we could also talk about whether this is at all a parsimonious or elegant explanation, or whether it just, makes things just complicated to the point that it's hard to take that hypothesis seriously anymore. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And like the main argument against your best argument, it's like obviously it's problem of evil, I suppose. And so I'm not expert in Thomist, although I'm studying University of St. Thomas Aquinas, but I know that some Thomists, like, if I am right, it's like Edward Fraser, he doesn't like this approach of free will defense, because maybe this issue with causality from God, something like this. But mm-hmm. I don't remember that he used this argument from free will defense. But in your book, you use this free will defense in some part. So again, do you see any tension between classical theism and also this libertarian free will defense, like Plantinga style?
No, I don't know if I'd go exactly the route Plantinga does. Let me say at the beginning, yes, free will, libertarian free will, the free will defense, or a theodicy that incorporates free will. So a theodicy is a story that theists tell to show that it's not inconsistent or even unlikely that we would experience a world of this distribution of suffering if God exists, right? That's what a theodicy is up to. A theodicy is different than a defense, right? A theodicy is actually trying to give like a very full account of why the world is the way it is in its negative states of affairs, whereas a defense is more modest. It's showing, well, you just haven't shown me this is like deeply inconsistent with theism, right? I give a theodicy in my book, and I have a free will element. It's not the only element of my theodicy, but it is an element. So all right, why is this? This is probably worth talking about. Why is this controversial among Thomists? Well, it's controversial among Thomists because they hold to the idea to which I think you should hold to if you're a theist of universal causality, right? That there's no ounce of being in the universe that isn't given to us from God, including our actions, including our free actions, right? Is this incompatible with free will? I don't think so. Unless you're confused on what kind of cause God is, right? God is he's a metaphysical cause. He's a transcendent cause. He's not a mechanical cause like other things are causes in the universe, right? God is the source of the existence of all finite things, of all essences and all natures, including free beings, us, right? Libertarian agents. So you got to do some metaphysical work here to make sense of this. But I think what the Thomist should say is this, right? That what God does is he gives being to essences or natures. And some of those essences are essences that are rational beings. And to be a rational being is the sort of thing that we can consider the space of reasons, and we can contingently determine ourselves on a particular course of action, hopefully to reach our ultimate state of perfection, right? That it is our nature to use our freedom of choice, our fallible freedom of choice, to reach our terminal freedom or freedom of excellence. Now, in the Thomistic tradition, the will is determined only to the good as such, right? It's just the case that the only thing that can truly determine the will would honestly just be the sight of God, the supreme good, right? Every other good is a finite good, right? There's reasons of why we might consider this finite good. There's reasons of why we might consider that finite good. And as finite goods, they are not inherently efficacious or determining of our will. So traditionally, metaphysically, the will, this is important, as the rational appetite, just is our power to end deliberation. The will is an active power. It's an active power to end deliberation, to say, I choose you. In other words, the will is the active power to make efficacious any finite motive that is not inherently efficacious on its own. That is what the will is. And that is sort of constitutive of our nature. Now, if that's right, there are other principles at play. And one principle that's at play traditionally in classical theism is that God governs things according to their nature, right? God isn't going to just like perform miracles all the time and override the natural course of the universe, because that sort of undermines the logic of creation, which is creating beings with actual natures that move towards their states of perfection, right? So this relates to the free will issue in a couple of ways, right? So if think of it like this, only God is infallible by nature, because only God is purely actual, only God is perfect, and only in God is he already his ultimate end, right? God doesn't have to strive towards any further perfection, right? God's being just is his terminal perfection, right? So he can't fail to get to where he needs to go. Beings like us that are sort of journeying towards a state of further perfection and virtue and life of God, that we can be actualized along certain dimensions to be made more excellent, right? Instantiations of the kind of thing that we are. We can fail, and we can fail in our judgments as well, right? We're fallible. We can fail to consider certain things that we habitually know when making particular judgment. We know this from experience, right? Like we say all the time when we sin, I knew better, right? So what happened? Well, you failed to bring to mind a particular rule or consideration when you made a particular judgment, that your judgment was defective. It suffered a privation in traditional terminology, and you sinned because there should have been a consideration in your judgment that you habitually know that you did not apply to that judgment. And so you failed, right? You failed to make the right sort of moral judgment that was necessary to push you along in your course of flourishing. Now, this is a very complicated matter, but what I'm trying to say is that it is of our nature to have a fallible freedom. We're not by nature infallible. Only God is, right? So if God governs things according to their nature, he is going to permit the possibility of our failure, right? And that's just sort of like a cost of doing business, of bringing beings like us into the world. He supplies us with all of our being and actuality, but that doesn't take away from our real secondary causality in the world as free libertarian agents. I really don't think that there's a conflict here. Could God, like by miracle or special grace, always prevent us from making poor, sinful decisions? This is where the issue gets complicated, because I think a lot of Thomists would say, yes, there's nothing in God's omnipotence that could stop him from doing that. However, if you understand the logic of creation and God governing things according to their nature, then there's a good metaphysical reason of why, even if God could do that, he would not do that. Which, if you run that logic all the way through, it might actually mean that God couldn't do that in a sort of an extended sense, right? So what Thomists should say, both from within their own philosophical school and with good theology and from scripture, is that God gives us everything we need, right? To make sure that we do get to heaven, right? He gives us all the graces and help that we need, but it's still within our power to fail, to resist, to reject, to introduce sin into the world. And that's us, that we are the defective instruments that introduce those evils into the world, us or the demons or what have you, right? And I think that is Thomas's position. I think that is entirely consistent with libertarian free will. And I think that is an important but not exclusive part of making sense of the types of evil and suffering we have in the world. Sorry, there's a lot there, but again, it shows to say that, like, these things for the Thomist they're not system independent. To really understand them, you have to kind of understand, well, what is the metaphysics? What is Thomas's philosophy of nature? What is Thomas's account of the will? Like, what is the will? For him, it's a rational appetite. It's an act of power to end deliberation. So you kind of need to understand a lot of these things to see why they're not incompatible with the divine universal causality, why God permits these faulty decisions, and how that factors into the wider story of how suffering or why suffering is permitted in creation and all that sort of stuff. So it's a big issue, but I think the Thomists can give an actually really good account of it at the end of the day. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you so much. So much stuff, friends. You can read the book by link in the description box. I will leave this link to this book because so many questions in my mind now. But maybe like two final practical questions, I guess.
Yeah.
How do you combine like your intellectual, spiritual life with like fitness life? Because as I see people, philosophers or bodybuilders, but not both, because you can have success in both spheres, but as you show, you can actually try to do this. So how do you manage this?
Yeah, well, thanks. So for people who are unfamiliar, even though my academic background is philosophy, just by a series of odd and somewhat interesting events, I run my own business in the fitness industry. So fitness has been a part of my life for a long time. The fitness stuff is what subsidizes all this philosophy stuff, which is nothing but an economic drain. But you got to do it because you love it, right? So I mean, I've always, like, the romantic ideal of the philosopher. You go back to the ancient, Greek philosophers, and like philosophers wrestled, man. Right, right. It was a way of living. It wasn't just something that you did in the stuffy ivory tower, turning out all these like, just mostly boring academic papers. Man, no, the philosophy is it's a mode of being, right? And it's not just about trying to answer tough and difficult questions, certainly big, important questions. It's also about trying to live a life of virtue, right? And I mean, this obviously connects with our physical embodiment. If you're Christian, or even if you just hold to this sort of perennial philosophy, we're not just rational entities, we're rational animals. We're hylomorphic compounds, to follow Aquinas, right? We have these bodies, right? This is constitutive of us. And we can choose to either take care of our bodies and find virtue through those pursuits, right? Of finding some reasonable and effective means of physical exercise, which can help us in acquiring fortitude. It's one of the, cardinal virtues. Also disciplining our desires, right? This is a traditional line of thought, disciplining the desires to make the good at first accessible, then effortless. We might think that there's some role that dietary discipline has to play in that, right? So we have fortitude, we have temperance. These are really important cardinal hinge virtues. And I think that while they're not exclusive to diet and exercise, I think thinking about how we take care of our bodies, either what we produce with our bodies in terms of physical exertion, sport, weightlifting, various forms of exercise, can be very useful for those pursuits. And also temperance, right? Not being gluttons, so for me, getting deeper into this tradition, when you're young and you're into fitness, you just want to be ripped and be a narcissist, right? Which is not great. It's not great for sure in the long term. But my perspective has changed, especially, as I discovered, traditional virtue ethics and Christianity for sure, of how to reorient and reshape your intentions around, diet and exercise to try and integrate it into the whole of hopefully a virtuous life. And there's a balance to be struck there. But I think that to neglect that is to neglect an important aspect of our life, our physical embodiment. So yes, I think everybody should strive to be healthy. I don't think everybody has to be a bodybuilder. I'm certainly not a bodybuilder. I'm in the fitness, but I'm not a bodybuilder. But I think everybody should have some sort of physical activity in their lives to try and keep themselves in good shape. And they should pay attention to what they eat, and they should strive to be temperate. Yeah, absolutely. It's part of, I think, the philosophical way of being. I think it's part of the Christian life. If you push me on it, I mean, it's why we fast in some respects, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's very good recommendation for all of us, I think. Yeah, and final question, what books could you recommend for our listeners to deep dive or to understand more these questions that you bring in the book?
Yeah, I guess, we covered a lot of territory, so I guess it depends on exactly what school of thought you're interested in. So let me recommend a few, I think, good, accessible introductory books. If you're interested in Thomistic metaphysics, there's a book called The One and the Many by Father Norris Clark. Wonderful book in terms of just general metaphysics. I think it's probably the best. So I'll say if you want to get into the whole essence, existence, form, matter, all that stuff, the spooky metaphysics, which I think is awesome and true, check out The One and the Many by Father Norris Clark. If you want to see that system deployed for a sort of robust argument for God's existence, then this book is a little bit more advanced, but I think your audience will enjoy it. Aquinas' Way to God by Dr. Gavin Kerr, a good friend of mine. And he's looking at Aquinas' argument in his De Ente et Essentia. A tremendous book. So the introduction will kind of give you the metaphysics, and then Gavin will take you on the path to God. You mentioned Richard Swinburne. So I even though I have a number of disagreements with Professor Swinburne, I think he is a very admirable mind, and I think his book, Is There a God or Does God Exist? I always forget the title, whichever one it is a good example, because there's like 40 books out there of like, does God exist or is there a God, right? Like whatever the one is by Richard Swinburne, get that one. I think that's a good one of just that latter approach that we talked about, where Swinburne is saying, no, God is the best and simplest explanation of this, that, and the other thing. I think that's a good, and he does actually have a thinner, even more simplified version as well, but I forget the title of that, but I remember enjoying that. So that might be good. And I'll give one more plug to I think a very sharp and brilliant mind, Dr. Joshua Rasmussen. He's got a book called How Reason Can Lead to God. And I think he's somebody, again, that's doing a nice job of synthesizing a lot of traditional thoughts with a lot of what's kind of going on in contemporary philosophy of religion. It's an accessible book, but not at the expense of being rigorous and thorough. So I would commend that as well. It's just some starting points. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you so much. Again, it was Pat Flynn and his book, The Best Argument for God, link in the description box. So thank you so much. It was great pleasure to speak with you, and I hope to see you sometimes in the future. God bless, maybe.
It's
Спасибо
been
за
a real joy.
приглашение.
Thank you so much for having me on.